I had just moved into my house a few months ago, a quiet little place in a suburban neighborhood that seemed peaceful at first glance. The houses were lined up neatly, lawns were trimmed just right, and everything looked like a picture-perfect postcard of American suburbia. That was until I met Karen. Karen was the kind of neighbor you hear about in horror stories, the self-appointed queen of the block, the one who thought she had a say in everything, even things that had nothing to do with her. She had the signature short, choppy haircut, always carried a Starbucks cup, and somehow always had a reason to be outside whenever anyone so much as breathed wrong near her property. At first she was just a minor nuisance. She'd give me unsolicited advice about how to trim my bushes or make comments about my trash bins being too close to the curb. Annoying but harmless. I mostly just nodded and ignored her. But then she decided that my driveway was community property. It started one Saturday morning when I walked outside to find a car parked right in the middle of my driveway. I stood there for a moment, utterly confused, before looking around to see if maybe someone was just running inside for a second. No one was in sight. I walked around the car, an obnoxiously large white SUV, and checked if anyone was inside. Nope. That's when Karen came waltzing out of her house, acting as if she had just solved world hunger. "Oh, don't mind that, dear," she said with a wave of her hand. "That's my son's car. He's visiting for the weekend and our driveway is full. So I told him he could use yours. You don't mind, right?" I blinked at her, thinking maybe I had misheard. "Actually, I do mind. This is my driveway." Karen scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just for a little while. He'll be gone later tonight." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my patience. "Karen, you didn't ask me. This is private property." She just rolled her eyes. "We're neighbors. We help each other out. Besides, it's not like you're using it right now." I stared at her, dumbfounded. Who in their right mind just assumes they can take over someone else's property because they aren't using it at the moment? I didn't care if her son was the Pope. My driveway was my driveway. "Move the car," I said firmly. "Now." Karen huffed and puffed, acting like I was the most unreasonable person on the planet, but eventually she called her son and told him to move it. He wasn't happy either, glaring at me like I had personally ruined his day. The moment they were gone, I thought that would be the end of it. I was very, very wrong. The next day, I woke up to find 2 cars in my driveway. Not one. 2. One was the same white SUV, and the other was a sedan I didn't recognize. My blood boiled. This was no longer an accident or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Before I could even storm over to her house, Karen was already outside, acting like she owned the entire street. "Oh, good morning," she chirped, as if she wasn't blatantly disrespecting my property. "I figured since you weren't using your driveway yesterday, you wouldn't mind if we used it again. We had some guests over." I saw red. I wasn't even angry at this point, I was livid. "Move the cars." Karen sighed dramatically, placing a hand on her hip. "You're being really difficult about this. It's just a driveway. If you weren't so selfish, you'd move the cars. Or I'm calling a tow truck." That shut her up. Her eyes narrowed, but she pulled out her phone and started calling whoever owned the sedan. It took a solid hour for both cars to be gone, and Karen had the nerve to mutter something about me being unfriendly under her breath. I thought that was the end of it. But of course it wasn't. Later that evening, I was outside watering my lawn when a tow truck rolled down the street. I barely glanced at it until it slowed down and stopped right in front of my house. I frowned. That was odd. I wasn't expecting a tow truck. Then Karen came marching up with the most self-satisfied look I had ever seen. "I figured if you're going to be so rude about driveways," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "you should at least follow the HOA rules yourself. And guess what? Your car is too close to the sidewalk." I looked at her. Then I looked at my car. It was maybe a few inches closer to the sidewalk than usual, but nothing that warranted a tow. Karen just smirked, arms crossed like she had just won some imaginary battle. "You'll have to pay the fine to get it back." I felt my jaw tighten. This wasn't just annoying anymore. This was war. The silence that followed was thick with tension, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. But Karen had no idea what she had just unleashed. The next morning, I found a fresh violation notice tucked under my windshield wiper. Unauthorized use of driveway space. Fined, $250. It was almost impressive how fast Karen worked. Almost. I took a deep breath and decided to play it cool. I wasn't about to let her see me sweat. Instead, I grabbed my phone and did what any reasonable person would do. I started researching. HOA bylaws, property rights, municipal codes. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to find out that I came armed with knowledge. Meanwhile, the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing. Apparently, Karen had been at it again, targeting another neighbor for having a garden gnome too close to the sidewalk. Someone else got fined for their Christmas lights still being up in February. People were getting fed up, but no one wanted to challenge her head-on. That's where I came in. That afternoon, I parked my car exactly where I had before. I even took a tape measure to make sure it was perfectly within my property line. And then I waited. Sure enough, less than an hour later, Karen stormed up my driveway, clipboard in hand, face redder than a sunburnt tomato. I didn't even need to look up to know she was fuming. "Did you not see the notice?" she snapped, tapping her pen aggressively against her clipboard. I looked up, keeping my expression neutral. "Oh, I saw it. But according to Section 4.2 of the HOA bylaws, my driveway is private property. And according to the city zoning laws, you have no authority to enforce parking restrictions on private property. So." I trailed off, watching as her face twisted into something between confusion and fury. She wasn't used to being challenged, that much was obvious. "The HOA has discretionary power," she barked. "And I have every right to." "Actually, you don't," I cut in, keeping my voice calm. "You see, discretionary power only applies to common areas. And unless you can prove my driveway is communal property, which it isn't, you're overstepping." Again. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't backing down, but I could tell she was scrambling for a new angle. And then, in a move that I could only describe as utterly deranged, she whipped out her phone and started taking pictures of my car. "I'll escalate this to the board," she threatened. "You'll see." I fought the urge to laugh. "Oh, I'm counting on it." And with that, she stormed off, practically shaking with anger. I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that night, just as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it, the distinct sound of a car engine idling too close to my house. Peeking through my blinds, I spotted Karen's car parked across the street, headlights off, but clearly watching. It was beyond unsettling. The next morning, I woke up to find something that made my blood boil. A tow truck. Parked in front of my house, with its hook already latched onto my car. And standing next to it, with the smuggest expression I had ever seen, was Karen. "I warned you," she said, arms crossed as the tow truck revved its engine. That was it. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. As the dust settled from the previous chaos, I found myself staring at the latest absurdity Karen had orchestrated. My driveway, which she had so arrogantly claimed as public property, was now marked with bright orange construction cones and an obnoxiously large, "No Parking HOA Property" sign that looked like it had been stolen straight from a government building. For a moment I just stood there, blinking. The audacity of it all was almost impressive. Almost. But then rage bubbled up. It wasn't just about the driveway anymore, it was the principle of it. This woman had decided that my property was hers to control, and I was done playing defense. I took a deep breath and calmly walked over to remove the cones, but the moment I touched one, Karen's screech echoed from her porch. "That is not your property. Those cones are there for safety reasons." I turned slowly, my patience hanging by a thread. "Safety reasons? Karen, this is my driveway. My property. You do not have the right to dictate who parks here." She scoffed, folding her arms. "Oh, but I do. According to HOA guidelines, any unregistered vehicles are considered trespassers. I'm enforcing the rules." I smirked. "Karen, my car is registered. With the DMV in my name for my address." Her eye twitched. "Well, I haven't seen the paperwork. And until I do, those cones stay." I had to physically restrain myself from laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of her logic. Instead, I simply walked back into my house and made a few phone calls. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. Later that evening, I heard a commotion outside. Peering through the blinds, I watched as a tow truck rumbled up the street and backed into my driveway. My car was still parked there. A chill ran down my spine. She wouldn't. Karen stood beside the tow truck driver, gesturing wildly. My blood ran cold as I saw her waving a piece of paper around, probably some fake document she'd fabricated, claiming my driveway was now HOA jurisdiction. Oh, she had no idea what she'd just done. I rushed outside just as the tow driver was stepping out of his truck, looking hesitant. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The driver looked at me, then at Karen. This lady said the car is illegally parked on HOA property. I was called to tow." Karen's smug grin nearly made me see red. "You refused to move your car, so I took matters into my own hands. You'll have to pay the release fee. Maybe next time you'll follow the rules." I stared at her for a moment, then took out my phone. Alright, cool. Let's get the police involved then. The tow driver paled. Wait, what? Karen's smile faltered. Oh, don't be dramatic. You parked illegally. On my own property, Karen. And you just attempted to steal my car. That's grand theft auto. I tapped my phone screen and put it on speaker as the line connected. Hello, yes, I need an officer to come to. Karen's confidence crumbled like a cheap cookie. Wait, no. This is just an HOA enforcement issue. No, Karen, I interrupted. This is a felony. The tow driver, clearly not wanting any part of the mess, mumbled, I think I'm gonna need to see some paperwork before I do anything. He got back in his truck, likely regretting taking this job in the first place. Karen's face turned several shades of red. You can't just call the police on me. Oh, but I can. And I just did. At that moment, the universe decided to reward me. A police car happened to be patrolling the neighborhood and turned onto our street, slowing as it approached my driveway. Karen let out a strangled noise, her power trip collapsing around her. The officer stepped out, giving me a nod. Got a call about a vehicle dispute? I crossed my arms. Oh, it's more than that. My neighbor here tried to have my car towed from my own driveway, claiming HOA authority she doesn't have. And I have reason to believe she forged documents to make it happen. Karen immediately launched into a defensive rant, waving her arms like a lunatic, but the officer shut her down. Ma'am, if what he's saying is true, this is a serious issue. Do you have documentation proving you had the legal right to tow this vehicle? She sputtered. The HOA has rules. I'll need to see those rules then. And any paperwork you provided to the towing company. I watched as Karen's confidence drained away completely. She had nothing. Not a single shred of evidence. Just entitlement and ego. The officer turned back to me. Would you like to press charges? I let the question hang in the air, savoring the way Karen's eyes widened in horror. And that's when I decided to let her sweat a little longer. Oh, I haven't decided yet. But I'll definitely be filing a report. Karen looked like she wanted to scream. But for once, she kept her mouth shut. Little did she know this was just the beginning. Because I had an even bigger move planned. The next morning, I woke up to an unfamiliar sound outside my house. A low rumbling that didn't belong to any vehicle I recognized. Pulling back the curtain, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A massive construction truck was parked at the edge of my driveway, and a group of workers stood next to it, reviewing blueprints. Karen was there too, standing smugly with her arms crossed, talking to a man in a neon vest. I threw on my shoes and stormed outside. What's going on? I demanded, making a beeline for the group. The man in the vest glanced at me and then at Karen, hesitant to answer. Oh, good morning, Karen said with exaggerated politeness. You didn't hear? The HOA approved a project to widen the neighborhood walkway. Turns out your driveway is the perfect spot for an extension. I blinked, barely processing what she was saying. Excuse me? Karen's smirk widened. This area, she gestured to my driveway, was deemed an ideal location for additional pedestrian access. The HOA voted on it last night. Didn't you get the notice? Of course I hadn't. Because there was no notice. This is private property, I said through gritted teeth. You can't just take part of my driveway. The man in the vest cleared his throat awkwardly. Actually, the HOA claims this portion is considered communal space due to an old zoning clause. I nearly laughed. There's no way that's legal. Karen gave me a condescending sigh. Feel free to challenge it, but by the time you do, the work will already be done. She had gone too far. This wasn't just about her pettiness anymore. This was theft, plain and simple. I needed to act fast. I didn't bother arguing with her anymore. Instead, I whipped out my phone and snapped photos of everything. The workers, the truck, the so-called blueprints, and, most importantly, Karen standing there, reveling in her own corruption. Then I went inside and made 2 phone calls. First to my lawyer. Second, to the local news station. Within the hour, a news van pulled up just as the workers were about to start demolishing a chunk of my driveway. A reporter and cameraman hopped out, clearly intrigued by what I had told them over the phone. Karen's confident stance wavered when she saw them approaching. The reporter wasted no time, walking straight up to her. Ma'am, can you explain why the HOA is attempting to seize a homeowner's private driveway for a construction project without proper notification? Karen stammered, her usual arrogance slipping. This is HOA business. It's not. And you are the one who initiated this? The reporter pressed, shoving a microphone in her face. Do you have legal documentation proving the HOA's right to this land? The man in the vest, sensing trouble, started backing away toward his truck. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing they were involved in something shady. Karen looked around wildly, but there was no one to save her. She had wanted control. Now she had the full attention of an investigative news team. The cameraman focused on her as she struggled to come up with an answer. But there was nothing she could say that wouldn't incriminate her. I watched in satisfaction as the scene unraveled, but I knew this wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to give up that easily. If anything, this would make her more desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. I just had to wait for her next one. That night I barely slept. I kept expecting some last-ditch act of pettiness from Karen, maybe a bogus noise complaint, a random violation notice stuck to my door, or even a desperate plea to the HOA board to cover for her. But nothing happened. At least not yet. By morning, the news story had already started gaining traction. The local station aired the segment, showing Karen's awkward, fumbling responses and my side of the story laid out in full detail. The online comments were brutal. Classic HOA power trip. Hope the homeowner sues her into oblivion. This woman looks like she just realized she's going to be the next viral meme. Gotta love when entitled people get a taste of real consequences. It was only a matter of time before Karen realized just how badly she had screwed up. Around noon, I stepped outside to check my mail, half expecting another bogus fine, but what I found was far worse. A large orange sticker was plastered on my front door, and my stomach twisted when I read the bold letters. Notice of property violation. I yanked it off, scanning the ridiculous accusations. Apparently, my mailbox was non-compliant with HOA regulations. My landscaping was neglected and unsightly. Even my front door color was supposedly in violation of the HOA's rules. It was pure nonsense. And I knew exactly who was behind it. I marched over to Karen's house, but before I even got to her porch, the door swung open. She stood there, arms crossed, a smug smile back on her face. "Oh, hello," she said, pretending to be surprised. "I was just about to call you. It seems your property has several compliance issues. You'll need to correct them immediately or face fines." I held up the notice. "You think this is going to fix the mess you're in?" Karen's smile faltered for half a second before she recovered. "I don't know what you mean. The HOA takes violations very seriously. If you have a problem, you're welcome to file an appeal." She thought she was in control again. She thought this little power move would intimidate me into backing down. She had no idea what was coming next. I pulled out my phone and opened an email I had received that morning. "I already filed something better than an appeal," I said, watching her expression shift. "See, after your little stunt yesterday, I did some digging. And guess what I found?" I turned the screen toward her. Karen's face paled as she saw the official letterhead from the State Board of Homeowners Associations. "Turns out, your little unauthorized land grab wasn't just unethical. It was illegal." I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough to make sure she felt every word. "The state is launching an investigation into the HOA. They're reviewing all past complaints against you and your board. If they find evidence of fraud, embezzlement, or any other violations, well, let's just say you'll have bigger problems than my non-compliant mailbox." Karen's jaw clenched, her fingers twitching at her sides. "You're bluffing," she hissed. "Am I?" I scrolled down to another part of the email. "Oh, and by the way, since this mess made the news, a few former homeowners in the neighborhood decided to come forward. Apparently you've been running this HOA like your own personal fiefdom for years." Karen's lips parted slightly, her confidence crumbling. "Fraudulent fines, misused funds, bullying homeowners into compliance. The list goes on." I smiled. "The state is sending auditors next week. Hope you've kept good records." For the first time since this war started, Karen looked genuinely afraid. I turned to leave, feeling the weight of victory settle on my shoulders. But as I reached the sidewalk, I glanced back. Karen was still standing there, gripping the doorframe so hard her knuckles turned white. This wasn't over for her. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't planning to go down quietly. And that meant I had to be ready for whatever she did next. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. The HOA investigation had spread like wildfire, and it wasn't just the local news picking up the story anymore. Online forums, community groups, and even a few legal watchdog websites had latched onto it. People were coming forward with their own horror stories about Karen and her iron-fisted rule. But Karen? She had gone silent. No more smug morning walks. No more surprise violation notices. Her car was still in the driveway, so I knew she hadn't skipped town. But I wasn't naive. I knew she was planning something. I just didn't expect it to happen that fast. Late that afternoon, I was in my garage when I heard a sharp knock at the door. When I opened it, I found two men in uniforms standing on my porch. Police officers. "Mr. Carter?" the taller one asked. "We need to ask you a few questions." My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Sure. What's this about?" The shorter officer glanced at a notepad. "We received a report that you were seen vandalizing property in the neighborhood late last night." I blinked. "Vandalizing? What property?" "A house on your street had its front door spray painted, tires slashed, and security cameras damaged. The homeowner claims you were seen near the property." I didn't even need to ask whose house it was. Karen. She was setting me up. I let out a slow breath, keeping my voice level. "That's ridiculous. I was home all night. You can check my security cameras." The officers exchanged glances. "You have security cameras?" "Yeah, and they record everything." I folded my arms. "If you want, I can pull up the footage right now." A flicker of doubt crossed the taller officer's face. "That would be helpful." I led them inside, pulled up my security feed, and scrolled through the timestamps. The footage was crystal clear. I hadn't left my house all night. "Looks like you're telling the truth," the officer admitted. "But that raises another question. Who really vandalized her house?" A realization hit me like a truck. Karen had staged the whole thing. She was so desperate to paint herself as the victim that she had trashed her own property just to frame me. I turned to the officers. "You said her security cameras were damaged, right?" They nodded. "Convenient," I muttered. Almost like she didn't want them recording what really happened. The shorter officer rubbed his chin. "You think she did this herself?" I shrugged. "All I know is that I wasn't there, and the only person who benefits from framing me is Karen." The officers exchanged another look, then stood. "We'll follow up with her. If she filed a false police report, that's a crime." As they left, I finally allowed myself a smirk. Karen thought she could outmaneuver me. But this time she had made a mistake she couldn't erase. And I was going to make sure she paid for it. Karen had played her final card, and it was a bad one. Filing a false police report? That was desperate even for her. But I wasn't about to sit back and wait for karma to do its job. I had something she didn't: proof. That night, I combed through my security footage again, not just for my alibi but for any strange activity. I had almost given up when I noticed something peculiar. At around 2:37 a.m., a shadowy figure crept across Karen's front yard. The footage wasn't perfect, but I could make out the basic details. A shorter individual, moving carefully, dressed in dark clothing. But here's the kicker. As they walked past my driveway, they passed directly under my motion-activated floodlight. For a brief second, their face was visible. And it wasn't me. It was Karen's own son. I sat back in my chair, stunned. I had forgotten she even had a son. He was in his early 20s, never around much, but this was gold. Karen had convinced her own kid to stage the vandalism. I immediately downloaded the footage and sent it to the police. Then, just for good measure, I forwarded it to the same news station that had covered the HOA driveway stunt. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was about to bury her in her own mess. The next morning, I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. By 10 a.m., 2 patrol cars were parked outside Karen's house. I watched from my porch as the officers knocked on her door. A few minutes later, Karen stepped outside, looking pale, her arms crossed tightly. Then they brought out her son. He looked just as nervous as she did, maybe even more. I couldn't hear the conversation, but judging by the way Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, it wasn't going well for her. And then, the moment of truth, one of the officers turned her around and cuffed her right there on the porch. A slow grin spread across my face. The queen had finally fallen. Neighbors peeked from their windows. A few even stepped outside, whispering among themselves. The same Karen who had spent years bullying people over trash cans and mailbox colors was now being led to a squad car in handcuffs. Poetic justice. As the police drove off, I leaned against my doorframe, soaking in the moment. But I had a feeling this wasn't quite over. Karen might have been caught, but people like her? They don't go down without a final trick up their sleeve. And I was ready for it. I expected the neighborhood to celebrate once Karen was taken away, but the aftermath wasn't as simple as I'd thought. By the next morning, rumors were already spreading. Some of the HOA board members, Karen's closest allies, were desperately trying to spin the story in her favor. According to them, this was all a misunderstanding. A simple mistake. A smear campaign. But the police don't arrest people over misunderstandings. And the news station wasn't about to let this story die. By noon, a fresh article had been posted online, complete with my security footage of Karen's son sneaking around at night. The comments section was ruthless. Neighbors were chiming in, sharing their own experiences with Karen's ridiculous abuse of power. Former HOA members revealed how she had strong-armed them into enforcing made-up rules. Even people outside our community weighed in, dragging her name through the mud. Then came the real twist. A neighbor I barely knew, an older man named Mr. Dawson, came to my door with a thick envelope in his hands. "You'll want to see this," he said, handing it over. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten. Inside were documents, legal paperwork, old meeting notes, even bank statements. "This is everything Karen didn't want anyone to find out," Mr. Dawson said. "She's been skimming money from HOA dues for years. That walkway project? It was never about pedestrian access. It was a cover-up to funnel funds into her own pocket." I flipped through the pages, stunned. Everything was in black and white. Karen had been stealing from the neighborhood right under everyone's noses. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked, still processing the weight of it. Mr. Dawson sighed. "Because people are scared to stand up to her." "You're not." That's when I realized, this wasn't just about my driveway anymore. Karen had been controlling this neighborhood like her personal kingdom for years, and no one had dared to challenge her. Until now. I wasted no time. I took the document straight to my lawyer, who nearly laughed at how blatantly illegal it all was. We had more than enough to dismantle Karen's entire operation. And that's exactly what we did. By the end of the week, Karen wasn't just facing charges for filing a false police report. She was now under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. The HOA board was in shambles, with some members resigning on the spot to avoid being dragged down with her. Then came the final blow. Karen's house went up for sale. Apparently, she was so deep in legal trouble that she couldn't afford to stay. And just like that, the same woman who had tried to claim my driveway as public property was forced to leave the neighborhood altogether. The day she left, I stood on my perfectly intact driveway and watched as the moving truck pulled away. No words were exchanged. No final threats. Just a long, bitter glare from Karen as she disappeared down the street for good. And with that, peace was restored.